box of tapes sat in the corner of my studio, gathering dust. I'd almost forgotten that they existed until that rainy Friday night when I found myself rummaging through the old plastic cases, half out of boredom, half out of some macabre curiosity. I'd picked up the tapes months ago during a silent auction at Lakewood Public Library. The old place was finally shutting down, and the town was more than happy to rid itself of whatever it could. At first, it looked to be nothing more than a series of tapes of old town meetings, safety PSA footage, some tapes labelled Lakewood Community Events 1985, and so on. But then one tape would catch my eye. Unmarked, blank on all sides, wrapped tightly in black electrical tape, as if someone had tried to seal it shut. The casing felt cold, heavier than it should have been. I knew better than to bother with it, but curiosity got the better of me. I pulled out my old VCR, slotted the tape inside, and leaned back, watching as the screen crackled to life with static. For a long moment, nothing appeared but jagged lines and patches of dark. Then the picture snapped into focus, and I found myself looking at a clearing by a lake, the water grey and almost viscous beneath a sky which looked just as bleak. The edges of the grainy image were smudged and uneven, like a nightmare that was frozen onto the film. The camera was steady, almost too steady, with the water rippling quietly. The group wandered into frame, mostly teenagers. It seemed by their looks remaining laughingly oblivious, talking to one another with complete disregard for the camera's presence. I felt this weird twist in my stomach as I watched them. They were normal, but there was something empty in their eyes, the laughter hollow, echoing in the background like it was part of the static. One of them, a boy with a shock of blonde hair, glanced toward the lens, his eyes wide and unseeing, and for a split second I thought he was looking directly at me. The screen flickered and dimmed. I scooted closer, my breath catching as the scene came back into focus. The teens were gone. The camera had moved, panning sideways toward the line of trees at the edge of the clearing. There, caught in the shadows, was a figure. Tall, thin, its arms hanging down too far, like they'd been stretched on a rack. It didn't move, just stood there, watching the empty clearing. The screen faded to black, and I found my hands were clutched in fists on the edge of the table, my heart racing slightly. Yet I continued to watch, mashing the rewind button so I would get everything. The tape started up once more, and this time the scene had changed. There were the kids again, but now they sat around a small fire, huddled and their faces pale and drawn. One of the girls was crying, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold herself together. Another kid, a tall, lanky boy with a scar across his cheek, was wiping his hands on his jeans, leaving dark smears. My gut twisted when I realized it was blood. I rewound the tape once more, but when I pressed play this time, the scene had changed again. The teens were running now, stumbling through the trees, the screams muffled by the static. The camera was running with them, all unsteady and jerky shots of terrified faces, scratched arms, blood-streaked clothes. One of them fell, his knee slamming against the ground, and he looked up, his mouth open in a silent scream as he stared at something just out of frame. A shadow fell over him, and he scrambled backward, his face contorted in terror. I could see his lips, the shapes of words I couldn't hear, begging. Then, from the side of the frame, a hand reached in, long, spindly fingers, the nails jagged and blackened, touching the boy's face. The image flickered out just as it did. I stared blankly at the screen, my pulse hammering in my ears, my throat dry. I didn't want to look at the tape anymore, didn't want to know what happened next, but part of me is sick. Twisted part needed to see it, to know just how far it would go. I took a deep breath and pressed the button. The tape whirred to life again, and the scene at the lake picked up. The water was darker now, inky, and it lapped at the shore in slow, ominous ripples. The camera zoomed in closer on the surface, and for an instant, I could have sworn that something moved beneath. Something beneath the surface, writhing in the depths. A voice crackled through the static, barely audible, yet unmistakable. "Why, are you watching?" The words sounded like fingernails on a chalkboard, scraping at my skin, and I jerked back, jabbing quickly at the pause button. My heart was racing, my skin cold and clammy, but I couldn't wrench my eyes away from the glowing screen. I told myself it was just a trick of the audio, a glitch, nothing more, but the words circled in my head, sinking deeper, as if they were meant for me. I flicked the VCR off, took the tape out of the player and just stared at it, feeling the weight of it in my palm. It's just a tape. I said to myself, just some old crap from a library that nobody gave a damn about anymore. Yet putting it to one side, I knew there was something hovering there in my chest, stuck like glue and unshakable. I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling. That image of the dark, twisted hand reaching towards the boy's face burnt into my brain. I could almost feel it, that cold finger grazing along my skin, leaving a streak of something sticky against my skin, like blood, like oil. I rolled over, face into pillow, and told myself it was my imagination, that I'd forget all about it by the morning. But finally, when I did sleep, I dreamed of shadows moving through the trees, of blood-smeared hands clawing through the dark, and a voice, low and whispering, repeating the same question over and over. Why are you watching? I didn't sleep much after that first night, kept hearing things in the silence of my apartment, the low hum of static that shouldn't be there, the feeling of it clawing through the walls, crawling up from the tape, and then shutting my eyes but images flickering behind my eyelids, shadows twisting in the trees, that cold hand stretching toward the boy, the blood streaked across their faces. It was as if the tape had burrowed into my head, whispering to me in the dark. The next morning I tried to brush it off. It was just an old tape, some messed up recording left to rot in a basement. Yet every time I walked by that tape, I'd feel that pull again, an itch just beneath my skin. I'd catch myself staring at it, wondering what I'd missed, what other secrets were hiding in that warped footage. By nightfall, I'd given in. I slotted the tape into the VCR once more and the screen flickered to life. Static crackled for a second before the scene kicked into view. The lake materialized this time darker, near pitch black, the water sluggish and thick, like tar. The trees around the lake seemed to press in closer, their branches hunching, scratching at the air. The same bunch of teens wandered in, their previous laughter silenced into fear. They didn't look at each other. They said nothing. They just stared into the trees bug-eyed, as if something just beyond that line of shadows was waiting. The camera zoomed in on one of the girls, her pale face streaked with dirt. She clutched something in her hand, something which looked like a torn tatter of fabric, or torn tatter of skin. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. The camera stayed with her as she slowly raised her head and looked straight into the camera at me. Her eyes were cavernous, glassy, and there was something smeared across her mouth now, a dark stain, wet and fresh. The screen flickered and returned to the picture. The scene had changed, though. The kids were scattered about the clearing now, some sitting, some on the ground, at odd angles. One boy lay face down, the shirt torn off, the pale flesh of his back exposed with jagged marks carved into the skin deep and raw. Another girl sat to the side, hands full of blood, fingers trembling as she wiped them on her jeans and streaked bright red across the denim. The camera shifted again, closer on her hands, capturing every smear, every drop. I watched my pulse quicken, a sick dread coiling low in my stomach. She wasn't just wiping her hands, she was smearing the blood across her skin, rubbing it in like she was painting herself with it. Then, out of the corner of my screen, that shadow came into view once again, half hidden in trees. This time he was closer, close enough for me to make out the shape of his face, or where his face should have been. Grey and waxy, the flesh of his face stretched taut over his skull, with empty sockets where his eyes should have been. He cocked his head to one side, his mouth pulling wide in a crooked smile that showed his blackened, jagged teeth. I felt a chill crawl down my spine as the figure took a step forward, his long, narrow fingers twitching, beckoning the kids closer. But they didn't move, just staring ahead, their faces blank, like they'd already accepted whatever fate awaited them. The screen flickered once more, and I was viewing the lake. An aquatic camera lens zoomed in to reveal water catching the faint ripples that spread across the surface. For a moment, nothing, just the steady ripple of the lake, dark and endless. Then with a slow, achingly slow movement, something began to rise from the water. It had started as shape a dark, fluid outline, barely perceptible beneath the surface. Now, as it rose higher, I saw it was a hand thin, bony, its fingers too long, too sharp. Water dripped from its knuckles, pooling beneath it, and I watched, transfixed, as the hand reached up, as if clawing its way out of the lake. The screen flickered on black, and for an instant, I thought it was the end of the tape. I let a shaky breath, but then, through the static, I heard it, a voice low and raspy, scratching through the speakers. "You're still watching." The words struck me, cold and direct, like a blow in the silent darkness. My heart hammered in my chest, while my pulse roared in my ears. I rewound the tape, hit play once more. This time, though, the voice was gone, replaced by the soft hum of static. My eyes were glued to the screen as my hands shook, my skin cold and clammy. "It is only a recording," I said to myself. "It's just some kind of glitch on this ancient tape." But the more I sat there staring into that static, the more I felt something crawl up my spine, like prickles. It was as if someone was standing behind me, watching, waiting. I whipped my head around, half expecting to find that twisted figure looming over me, but there was nothing. Only the dim glow of the screen cast its shadows across the room. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, while the image of that hand, clawing its way out of the lake, stayed burnt into my mind. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, those hollow eyes, that crooked smile, the blood smeared across their faces. Somewhere in the dark, I could swear I heard it too, the faint sound of static, whispering, calling me back to the tape. When eventually I fell asleep, I dreamed of the lake. I had stopped right at the very edge of the water, peering down at the surface heaving, dark water. The air was thick, heavy, clammily pressed against my skin, and it was hard to breathe. I felt something stir beneath the water, a dark shape moving just out of sight, and before I knew it, my feet were going down into the mud, dragging me down, pulling me closer to the water's edge. I pulled, trying to go back, but it was as if the ground held on to me, not allowing me to go. I looked down, and there, rising from the water, was that same hand, clawing its way toward me, fingers stretched wide, nails black and cracked. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. It reached to me, grazed against my skin, cold and wet, and there was a sudden pain, searing, from its nails digging into my skin. I woke up in an instant, all soaked with sweat, my chest heaving. I looked around my room, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to get rid of what was now only a nightmare of mine. But as I turned toward the corner of my room, I froze. There, on the floor, the tape lay on its side, its black casing smeared with something dark. I could have sworn I'd left it in the VCR, but here it was, staring up at me like it had waited. I picked it up, my hands shaking. It was cold underneath my fingers, all sticky. I told myself it was only a stain, just some dust or dirt off the floor, but as I peered closer, the dark smears looked red. Blood. I dropped the tape, stumbling back, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't want to touch it, didn't even want to look at it, but I couldn't leave it there. Couldn't just pretend it wasn't real. Taking a deep breath, I made myself pick it up, wiping my hands on my jeans as I shoved it back into the VCR. The screen flickered to life, the static crackling louder than ever. The dread settled in my chest, quick and easy, like an old friend. I didn't know what I'd find this time, didn't know how much worse it would get, but one thing was for sure. I couldn't look away. By the third night, I could feel it. The tape was no longer just a thing that sat on my shelf. It had burrowed into my mind, threading its way through every thought. The whisper scratched away at the back of my mind during the day. "You're still watching," hissed at me like a goad, drawing me back to the screen, daring me to see what came next, and I couldn't resist. The clock had long since ticked past midnight. The only light in the room, save from the dim glow of the TV, my hands were clammy as I slid the tape back into the VCR, my heart pounding in my chest. The screen flared to life with static, that familiar crackle that made a cold chill crawl up my spine. Then the image sharpened, and I found myself staring at the lake again. The water was darker now, inky black, rippling languidly under a thick, smothering fog that clung to the surface like oil. The camera held on the lake, as if waiting, watching, and I felt myself leaning forward, holding my breath, feeling that same pull in the pit of my stomach. The camera then slowly panned to the trees, the shadows thick and twisting between them with shapes moving within the darkness. For a moment, I really thought I might see the form of an individual tall, gangly, with limbs that seemed too long, bending at impossible angles. The camera cut away before I could get a good look, and suddenly I was looking at the group of teenagers again. They were standing at the edge of the clearing, all of them pale-faced and wide-eyed, with their gazes fixed on something just out of frame. Stillness froze them in place, a sort of terror that pinched their faces. One of the boys clutched his arm where blood dripped from his fingertips to join the pale, slick sheen of sweat that covered his skin. The others shook, eyes darting everywhere in expectation of something from out of the shadows. The screen flickered and cut back to the lake, zoomed in on a patch of water where ripples disturbed the surface. Slowly, a hand broke through, skin pale, stretched taut over bone, fingers long and sharp, the nails jagged, blackened. The hand twisted, its fingers clawing the air as if reaching for something to hold on to, something to drag down into the depths. A voice crackled through the speakers, barely louder than a whisper, but unmistakable. "You're here to watch." My heart thudded in my chest, and I felt myself pull back, but my eyes didn't leave the screen. The camera cut back to the kids, panning in on one of the girls stumbling backward, her face twisted in terror, her mouth making soundless screams, but as she turned to run, something caught at her ankle and sent her sprawling to the ground. The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing the horror etched into her expression as she scrambled backward, her fingers clawing at the dirt. A shadow fell across her and she looked up, her eyes wide and pleading, her mouth opening and closing as if begging for mercy. I watched, frozen, as a dark shape leaned over her, its head cocked to one side, its mouth stretching into a wide, jagged grin. The screen flickered again, and suddenly I was staring at the clearing, empty now. The only evidence there had been a girl being a dark stain on the ground, smeared across the grass. The camera circled in on the stain slowly, seeming to savour the image, seeming to show me what was left of her. My stomach twisted, and bile crept into my throat, yet I willed myself to keep on watching. I was unable to look away. It was like this tape had a hold on me, sucking me in deeper with every frame, every flicker of static. I wanted to stop, to turn it off and step away, but my hand wouldn't budge, my fingers frozen on the edge of the remote. The camera cut back to the lake now, the water dark and still, the fog thickening, pressing down onto its surface like a heavy weight. Then, in a slow dance, a shape began to rise from the water. At first, it was no more than a faint outline, barely more than a shadow, but as it drew closer, I could make out the details, the long, twisted limbs, the sharp, pointed fingers, the mouth stretched wide in a sickening grin. It looked straight at me, its empty eyes boring into mine, and I felt a cold, creeping dread settle in my chest. It leaned forward, the water dripping from its skin, its mouth opening to reveal rows of jagged, blackened teeth. I could almost feel its breath, hot and rancid, pressing against my face, filling the room with a stench of rot. Then it spoke again, in that rumbling rasp, dripping with malice. "Why are you watching?" The question came like a slap, and my breath caught my chest tight as the words echoed in my head. I wanted to answer, to say something, but my mouth would not move, my throat closing up as a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I could feel something on the other side of the screen, something watching me, waiting and hungry. The camera cut back to the kids. Now, they were lying on the ground, bodies twisted, faces frozen in terror, eyes wide and empty. Blood pooled around them, staining dirt, soaking into grass. One of the boys had his mouth open, his face twisted in pain, his hands clutching at his throat as if he were trying to choke down a scream. The screen flickered, and for a second I could have sworn that I saw myself, just a flash, a split-second image of my own face, pale and wide-eyed, staring back at me from the screen. Then it was gone, replaced by static, the crackling noise filling the room, growing loud, pressing down on me until I thought I would choke. I slammed my fist onto the stop button, yanking the tape out of the VCR with quivering hands, my heart hammering against my ribs. I hurled it across the room, watching in satisfaction as it rattled to the floor, lying there like some dead thing, a dark stain smeared across its casing. I wanted it out, thrown away, burned to ashes, anything to remove it from my line of vision. I couldn't force myself to move. I just stood there, staring at it, my skin crawling with the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to press play. That night, in bed, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing, replaying every frame, every flicker of that tape, and I had this feeling I wasn't alone. Something out there beyond the edge of the dark was waiting. I tried to close my eyes, shut it out, but it was seared onto my brain-twisted figures. The blood, that sickening grin. In its silence, I could hear it, that faint hum of static growing loud, closer, filling the room like a whisper. You're still watching. I didn't want to look at the tape anymore. That morning, as I caught myself standing over it lying on the floor, its black plastic case reflecting dully in the meagre light, I'd made up my mind to leave it alone. The very thought of touching it made my gut roll. Even thinking about hitting play again brought a sourness into my mouth. And yet the whisper, the soft, insistent whisper, had taken its place deep in my brain, echoing on and on and on, gnawing at me like a splinter I couldn't dislodge. You're still watching. It clawed at me all day, gnawing ceaselessly until it consumed nearly all of my thoughts by nightfall. My hands were shaking with the need to finish it, to uncover whatever secrets the tape held. I told myself it was just to free myself from it, to burn it, to erase it. But deep down, I knew the truth. Some sick part of me wanted to see just how far it'd go. I carefully slotted the tape back into the VCR, pressing play with a sense of grim finality. The screen erupted into a maelstrom of static, while a low hum reverberated through the room, seemingly coming from every corner and enveloping me, creeping insidiously under my skin. Then, with a flicker, the lake materialized on the screen. This time, something felt off. The water was thick and oily, as if something dark and viscous was churning just beneath the surface. The trees that ringed the clearing seemed closer, their branches reaching in toward the center, twisting like the scratches of claws cutting through the air. As the camera panned across the clearing, my stomach started to drop at what I saw waiting. The children, those adolescents, had flung themselves upon the earth, their bodies broken and twisted, their limbs tangled in strange, unnatural poses. Blood saturated the grass, forming pools round the heads, trickling from gaping wounds and gashes. Their eyes were wide open, faces upwards, filled with a terror that did not dim even in death. One girl lay on her back, mouth open in a silent scream, face twisted into an expression of pure agony. The camera zoomed in on her face, showing every ghastly detail, from the lips smeared with blood to the dark bruises flowering around the throat. One arm was stretched out before her, rigid, as if she were reaching for something, scrabbling at the air in one last, desperate attempt to hold on to life. I swallowed hard, and my throat constricted. My heart thudded in my chest. I very much wanted to shut it off, to avert my eyes, but instead, my gaze was fixed on the screen, caught in the horror being played out before me. The camera slowly moved back to the lake, where the waters were churning and bubbling as something was coming up from the depths below. A shape started forming beneath the surface, dark and twisted, with long, thin limbs like bare branches stripped of their leaves. The figure heaved through the water, its head tilted at the camera as if straining to look upward, its mouth stretching wide in a jagged grin showing teeth that were black and sharp. It stared at me, its eyes empty and hollow, and I felt a cold, creeping dread settle over my chest, pressing down with a weight that made it hard to breathe. I was transfixed, unable to look away, unable to blink, as the figure drew closer, its mouth opening to whisper the same words that had haunted me from the very beginning. "You're still watching." The screen went black, as I sat with the encroaching darkness, my heart hammering, the skin on my body turning clammy and cold. There was this feeling that it still wasn't done, that something was waiting out there in the static for me. There was a cold, damp feeling, as if water was seeping into my pores, thick, oil-like. I gasped, reaching for my chest as words repeated themselves inside my head without stop, pulling me under and flooding me with the darkness. I stumbled backward and dropped to the floor, where my hands shook uncontrollably as they scraped at my skin, trying to scrub the remaining feeling off. In front of me was the cassette, its black plastic casing smeared with dark stains that looked like blood. I didn't remember touching it, but my hands were sticky and cold, and as I looked at them, I realized, with a sickening jolt, that they were smeared with something dark and wet. I sprang to my feet, my heart racing in my chest. As I stumbled backward, one terrible thought had possessed my mind. It wasn't just a tape. Whatever abominations had unfolded upon that screen, whatever terror I had borne witness to, had seeped through, infected the world of reality, snared me, and dragged me under into its twisted hell. I still could hear it, A humming that ran through the room filled my ears and grew louder and louder until it drowned everything else out, until it became a scream, low and guttural, and bounced around in my head. I reached out to clutch my head, stumbling backward, but no matter how hard I tried to shut it out, I couldn't. The whisper had changed now. The words had twisted, warped, until they became something else altogether. Now you're part of it. The screen flickered, and in the fleeting moment I caught a glimpse of myself staring back from the other side. My face was deathly pale. My eyes were wide open with terror. Blood trickled from the corners of my mouth, staining my skin a purplish hue as my lips stretched into a wide and twisted grin that no longer belonged to me. The lights in the room flickered and swayed as a cold hand clutched my shoulder, its grip pressing into my skin, pulling me down, dragging me deeper into the darkness. I tried to scream, but the sound faltered in my throat, stifled by a thick, oily sensation that filled my lungs, suffocating me. The world melted away into the darkness, and the last thing I heard was a soft hum of static buzzing in my ears, whispering secrets that called to me deeper, pulling at my very core as I fell into the abyss.